Well, hey folks, I weighed in today on the YNW Melly murder case down in Florida, and I went head to head with an impressive defense attorney. I'm not an attorney, and I want to know how you think I did as I shared why I believe this guy should be convicted of murder. Well, hey folks, thanks for joining me on Profiling Evil and this special video on the YNW Melly case. This is a murder case where a rapper is accused of killing two of his buddies. Now, the Florida prosecutor is saying he was guilty, even though they can't produce a weapon, but they do have other evidence that I'm going to talk about. I was going kind of head to head on court TV with the defense attorney, and boy, I'll tell you what, I had to agree with much of what she was saying, but I still believe that the state has produced enough information and frankly enough evidence, circumstantial, forensic, physical, some testimony that will find this guy guilty. And I really want to know what your thoughts are on this one. I have no right to suggest that I know the law better than this attorney, but I do know law enforcement and I do understand the investigative process. So I'm going to be looking for your comments on this particular one. So now, let's dive into this case. If you remember, YNW Melly, guy named Demons, last name of Demons, is accused of shooting two of his buddies in a vehicle and then staging a drive-by shooting to make it look like he had nothing to do with it. Well, over the course of this trial, the prosecution has brought out a couple of really important pieces of information. First is an alleged confession that Melly made a confession that he actually committed this murder to a guy named Peasy Gambino. Now, the defense is saying, nah, that's just the way that he was tweeting and texting and communicating on Instagram. The prosecution says, no way, we believe that it was a confession of sorts on a social media platform. It's going to be really interesting to see what happens on that. It was about that time that the state also presented kind of a eyebrow-raising Snapchat message about a co-defendant and an argument that was happening between Melly and his ex-girlfriend. And that thing kind of played in an interesting way in this case. Now, another piece of evidence that came out, in my opinion, that was really quite important was that the shots that killed the victims came from inside the vehicle. And more importantly, that the state proved that there was surveillance video from a recording studio there in Fort Lauderdale that captured the co-defendant, Williams, Thomas, and Melly hopping into this Jeep. Now, hours later at the hospital, there would be a completely different story. But what the investigation showed is that the place in which the defendant was sitting in the vehicle is most likely the location where the shots were fired from. It wasn't from the outside in a drive-by shooting, according to what I was picking up in testimony, but that the shots were fired from inside, including recovering a spent casing in the vehicle. So all of that is going to play heavily into this because it appears that the victims were shot from a location that originated the seat that Melly was sitting in. That's going to be a tough one to overcome. Now, the state also brought out the fact that Melly had ties to a gang. Now, one of the things that I spent a great deal on court TV today talking about were the cell phone pings. The defense attorney that was on with me, she doesn't believe that that had anything to do with the case, and it was only noise and probably detrimental to the prosecution's case. I'd like you to put your comments down below about whether you think that is the case, because frankly, a prosecutor can get pretty dang boring sometimes when they focus on the science of these kinds of things like cell phone location. Now, I was asked on court TV by Matt Johnson to talk about that cell phone location information. And so let's watch what my response was there.
And here to discuss, watching along with you at home, we have criminal defense attorney Rachel Kaufman here in studio. Thanks for joining us today. It's always a pleasure to be with you. And also joining us from London, England, we have commander and host of Profiling Evil podcast, Mike King. Thank you, sir, for taking the time. To you first, Rachel, when you're watching these closing arguments, prosecutors are trying to make a case and they're using puzzle pieces and trying to connect the dots for this jury because this was a lengthy trial. What is your observations? What do you think?
Well, my observations are that jurors, just like normal people, don't have a super long attention span. And as someone who, I've watched parts of this trial, but not the entire thing, it felt to me like the prosecutor was kind of getting lost in the weeds. I'm not really sure, how powerful her argument was. It sounds like she was going through the evidence, but it's also that phone is in dispute. The defense is saying, that phone has been tossed around amongst this kid's friends. Mm-hmm. So it may not be his. And so do I find, as it's going, I don't find the prosecutor's closing argument right now particularly effective.
Commander King, when we are talking about the evidence that they are trying to connect the dots for this jury, they are really talking about pings and locations of the cell phone. Can you speak to the accuracy of tracking in cell phones? Because that's really the new DNA these days.
Well, I'll say, Matt, and it's really nice to be on with Rachel and have that perspective from the defense, because I think she's absolutely right. The defense wants that prosecutor to wear the jury down and bore them to tears. And sometimes we can let the technology bore us instead of getting right to the actual facts. So you think about a cell phone, and it's really kind of an interesting thing because a cell phone location is derived from looking at 3 different cell phone towers. They call it triangulation. And in that process of triangulation, depending on how close the cell tower is, how strong the signal is, the sector that the signal is being derived from, can determine the accuracy. And so when you look on your mobile device, you'll see sometimes a little circle that's around the dot on the map you're looking at, and it says the certainty range is somewhere in this area. You can be sure this phone is within that. The difference is if law enforcement has gone in and got the device location, it's going to be much more accurate. And sometimes the two can come together and paint a really powerful story of exactly where that mobile device was at the exact moment in time. And so I think sometimes the prosecution, rather than get in the weeds, should just make it very clear and say, here's the science, there's an expert that can testify further to it, but you need to understand that the science can get this thing down to less than maybe 10 meters, or it's only going to be within 50 feet of this location.
Good point, sir. And, we do have to fit in a break right now, but in short, what were you going to say?
I'd say the defense still has the argument that it wasn't that his phone wasn't with him and that it had been given to someone else, so it doesn't really matter. That's what they need to focus on.
And that's what I was going to say as well. Rachel, thank you.
Bottom line is, I thought that the prosecution did a really good job of identifying where that vehicle was, where co-defendants were, and where the defendant's phone was. And so the real question comes down to this. Do you think it's probable, not possible, because it's certainly possible, but do you think it's probable that Melly loaned his phone out to somebody else? And maybe personalize it. Would you lend out a device that you keep all your personal information on, your personal photographs and everything else, just out to somebody willy-nilly? And especially if you have family plans or plans that you share with your friends, would you share that phone, not the plan, but share that phone with other people? And then, of course, one of the Achilles heels to this case, but something that could be positive for the prosecution, was the fact that law enforcement couldn't prove that Melly's DNA was inside of that vehicle, in the seat where the shots originated from. But in subsequent testing, they were able to recover DNA with some blood at the door handle, signifying someone getting out of the vehicle, and Melly couldn't be excluded in that DNA search. So again, that's going to be pretty interesting. So let's hear part of these discussions and what else I had to say on Court TV in regard to some of these issues.
Go to Rachel first on this one. He didn't take the stand in this particular trial. Do you think that that was a mistake? Would you? I know most of the time defense attorneys kind of say don't take the stand, or they, you know, but in this particular case, would you have suggested it?
I guess I'm more along the line, I like when my client can't testify. So I don't know if they've attempted to work with him on seeing if he could do something like that, or if it was just sort of like, it's not something that I do as a defense attorney, so we're not going to do it. I know that the jurors likely want to know if he can tell us where he was. And I know that even though they're going to be instructed that they shouldn't hold it against him, that he didn't explain where he was or subject himself to examination, jurors, again, are humans, and they're wondering what is he whispering to his attorney. They want to see, you know, it's easier to get some amount of sympathy and to create doubt. If you were to get on the stand in addition to the alibi witness and say, that is where I was, I fell asleep, this is what I was doing. I think the issue is going to be about the phone, you know, where was your phone, who did you give your phone to, and if you're not willing to give up who that person is, what is the likelihood that you actually did give it to someone else?
Right, because the defense was saying that there were multiple phones on this particular plan, and someone else exchanged the phone with him on occasions. You know, it was interchangeable. So I think that's why the prosecution was talking about, you know, you don't see other pictures, and they were trying to connect the dots with that and remind the jury of that testimony. Mike King, to you, do you think that this prosecutor connected the dots in the closing when they were talking about the phone records?
You know, I think she did a really good job of reminding the jury of a couple of things. One is maybe personalizing it. How many of us really let our phone go to other people, especially when it contains so much personal information anymore? How many of us have phone plans that are shared with other members of the family or others, and yet still don't let your phone go out of your hands? That was something I would really push hard on. And then I thought that they really hit a home run when they talked about the Wi-Fi signals and him being in those locations and only getting those Wi-Fi signals.
All right, well, Mike King there thinks that it was a home run. Let us know at home what you think. Join the conversation.
Well, at the end of the day, Matt Johnson asked me what my thoughts were. First, he asked me to kind of share what my thoughts were if I were prosecuting and what I'd want to bring out. And I shared a few comments. So, number one, I shared some comments about the Instagram information, about the fact that the surveillance showed the defendant getting into the vehicle where the victims were shot, in the seat where the gunshots originated from. The fact that there wasn't gunshot residue found on him, and what possibly could be some reasons behind that. This tie to gang activity, and this acknowledgement that he possibly could have loaned out his phone. Again, I don't buy it. And then a reminder that while they couldn't say it was his DNA in the vehicle, they didn't exclude it either. Let's listen to my comments there.
My friend, to you first there in London. Cheerio. And so the surveillance video, the phone tracking, and the ballistics, that really stood out to me of what she was really honing in on, the state of Florida, for evidence. But she said, we don't have the gun, we don't have the murder weapon. And, you know, what are your thoughts? What stood out to you? Do you think that they built a good case?
You know, it wasn't the Perry Mason moment that I was hoping for, Matt, but these cases that are built upon circumstantial evidence, I think, are really pretty dang strong because they include forensic evidence, physical evidence, alleged confessions through Instagram in this particular case. Eyewitness accounts are going to be questionable, but here's the thing I'd be wanting the jury to know. One is that there was that alleged confession on Instagram. Remind them of that. Remind them that there's surveillance video that puts the defendant getting into the vehicle where these victims were murdered, and that there was physical and forensic evidence to suggest that the shooting occurred inside the vehicle, and likely from the location where the defendant was seen sitting. I would own the fact that you don't have gunpowder residue on this guy, but I'd remind him that his clothing changed when he went to the hospital, and is it possible he could have showered and removed some of that? I think I'd remind him of these ties to violent street gangs, and I'd acknowledge the fact that the defense is arguing that the defendant loaned out his phone, but I'd remind them and ask them, is that something you do? And is it really probable that he's loaning out his phone? And then I'd remind the jury that the defendant couldn't be excluded from the DNA inside the vehicle, even though we know the defense will come forward and say, hey, they couldn't prove he was in there with DNA.
Rachel Kaufman, if you were representing this particular defendant, how would you combat some of that in your closings? What are you watching for?
What I'm watching for is a lot of what I watched with the state's closing argument is a lot of discussion about the evidence, none of which really ties it back directly to YNW Melly at the time of this incident. It's possible that he's having that he's taking selfies with that phone, a few days before. It really doesn't mean that he's not lending his phone to one of his friends who doesn't have that much money, and he's got a bunch of money, so he can help his friends. It's possible one of them had the phone. We don't have. A lot of this seems to be imaginative, and that's what I wanted to kind of talk about. In my closing, I would be talking about how the state should not be imagining things. I don't need them to get creative. False pretenses.
There was a lot of evidence that she was pointing to, Mike King, about the ballistics in all of this, but they don't have the weapon. They said that the weapon was actually one of the victim's weapon that he brought to his own murder. Talk to me about the fact that they were, according to their experts, able to say that the bullet that killed these individuals was from inside the car, in short.
Well, Matt, those bullets and the casings that are recovered are kind of like a fingerprint. When that bullet is fired, there is the impact, and there are creases and grooves and lands and markings that are left on the casing and left on the bullet as it spins out of that barrel that are very indicative of that weapon. And they're not alike, one weapon to another. So look at a fingerprint.
All right. Well, thank you to our special guests, Mike King and Rachel Kaufman, here in the studio. We'll be right back.
Well, there you go, folks. What's your thought? If you were sitting on the jury today with this short amount of reference material to go on, how would you be voting in this case? Did the prosecution do their job? And would you say that that's adequate evidence to find this guy guilty of murder? Or would you side with my co-presenter today and defense attorney, who indicates that it was nothing but a bunch of discussion about stuff that didn't matter? I'd be really interested in what your comments are, and I hope you'll put them down below. And folks, I hope you'll share Profiling Evil with all your friends. We really appreciate how you're helping us grow, and I hope you'll check us out on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and of course here on YouTube. And for those of you that like audio podcasts, please make sure to check out Profiling Evil podcasts on your favorite podcast platform. You know what? I'm closing up my trip here in London, and I'm leaving the office tonight for the last time and heading home. I hope you are all safe, and I look forward to getting home and enjoying a long weekend. And I look forward to continuing some of these true crime stories that we're exploring. So let's keep looking at these cases together. And thanks so much for your support of Profiling Evil. We'll see you soon at the next crime scene.